Well, hello there. Welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This episode is going to be slightly different, at the beginning at least, because I'm going to be doing a reading of one of the sections from my forthcoming book, Ghostlore, Unveiling 50 Phantoms That Have Haunted History. So we are going to have a look at the Poltergeist entry, but then after that we are going to have a little bit of a look at a particular point about Poltergeist that I think is worth investigating, and this is actually going to be the beginning of a multi-part series on Poltergeist and actually how they appear in folklore. So there is a bit of folklore in here after all. So as I say, we are going to have a look at this section from Ghostlore and then we'll get cracking. See you soon. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. It started small, with doors standing open that you thought you had closed. Your keys kept going missing, or the landline would ring and when you answered there was no one there. But now things have escalated and you can't pretend it isn't happening. Every door in your house is banging in a constant rhythm. The TV remote flies across the room, hitting the wall in an explosion of plastic. A shower of coins cascades from the ceiling in the corner, mirroring the stones falling on your roof. Every electrical appliance in your house throws out blue sparks, and you have no idea what your landlord can do about a poltergeist. The name poltergeist is synonymous with violent hauntings involving items thrown around the room, slamming doors or malfunctioning electrical items, among other phenomena. Whenever the term is associated with a haunting, it's clear something negative is going on. Many cases involve girls in their early teens, leading some to theorise a link between the emotional turbulence of puberty and poltergeists. Does this period of life attract these spirits, or is the activity the result of the girl's psychic powers? No one is quite sure. The term first appears in the Erasmus Alberus Dictionary of 1540, and it's made up of two German words, poltern, or to create disturbance, and Geist, or ghost, or it can also mean spirit as well. They were also known as Rumpelgeist, Gespenst, Kobold, and Spectre. The range of terms used to describe the spirits can make it difficult to find accounts of them before the 19th century, when poltergeist became a catch-all term. Despite this, one of the first recorded poltergeist episodes dates to 858 CE. This account, involving a farmhouse in Bingen, Germany, came from the Annals, written by a priest named Rudolf. The family living there suffered from stones being thrown, a phenomenon known as lithobolia, knocking on the exterior walls of the house, and fires breaking out. The spirit also started arguments between the inhabitants and whipped up animosity among the local community towards one particular man. Any time he walked into a house, the spirit set fire to it, forcing the man to live in his fields since the neighbours, understandably, refused to invite him in. The spirit even burnt the poor man's crops, and such was the ill feeling of the community towards him that he underwent a horrifying ordeal involving a hot iron to prove he was innocent. These crimes were happening around him, but he wasn't committing them himself. When he passed this awful trial, the church sent priests from nearby Mainz to exorcise the house. The spirit reappeared after the exorcism, claiming one of the priests was under his control, and it continued its activity for 3 years until every building had been burned down. In Rudolph's report, this was the work of a demon rather than a poltergeist, but later writers recognised hallmarks of poltergeist activity, such as stone throwing and mysterious fires. The idea of the spirit speaking to people reappeared in the legend of the Bell Witch from the 1800s Tennessee. A more recent example of a German poltergeist occurred in 1967 in Rosenheim. While most stories of poltergeists involve people's homes, this one occurred in the office of a law firm. Lights flickered, objects moved by themselves, electrical appliances refused to work, the telephones rang but there was no one on the line when anyone answered, and unexplained noises came from different parts of the building. Parapsychologist Hans Bender investigated the activity and noticed that the phenomena focused on 19-year-old secretary Anne-Marie Schneider. While Bender tried to find an explanation, perhaps related to Schneider's dislike of her job, the activity remained difficult to rationalise, although it's worth noting it stopped when she left her job. To this day, no one can definitively explain whether the phenomena was supernatural or psychological in origin. Historian P.G. Maxwell Stewart explains that in the Middle Ages, the poltergeist was a ghost or demon. By the 20th century, people discussed the phenomenon as a burst of physical energy, investigated by groups like the Society for Psychical Research. This shows how slippery the term is, as it responds to the beliefs of the age. While the poltergeist is listed here as a German spirit, thanks to its name and early accounts of their activity, stories of their chaotic outbursts occur all over Europe and the United States. The Bell Witch legend from early 1800s Tennessee, which was explored in Rebel Folklore, and the Enfield poltergeist phenomenon from 1970s London are two classic versions. Even further afield, the activity of the Tokolosh spirit in South African lore is incredibly similar to that of the poltergeist. The film Poltergeist from 1982, directed by Tobe Hooper, brought them to wider notice, and such spirits are now a mainstay of ghost hunting TV shows and horror films. So says my entry about the poltergeist in the forthcoming Ghostlore published by DK. But I wanted to dig into them a little bit deeper, since the poltergeist surprisingly has some crossover with folklore, and I know that a lot of people listening are obviously possibly more interested in folklore than ghost stories perhaps, but I do think that ghost stories have quite a lot that they can tell us, which helps with folklore and helps with an understanding of how folklore and legends work. And in this case, it's also quite important to see where the crossovers are actually unhelpful as well as helpful. Now, it is hardly surprising that there is that crossover in the first place between the poltergeist and wider folklore, because the poltergeist itself is really difficult to pin down, and in a lot of ways it is more than the range of defined phenomena ascribed to it today. So some of the phenomena ascribed to it by Alan Gold are things like percussive sounds, so that's all the raps and the thuds and whatnot, object movements, also codes of raps in order to actually provide communication, a sudden influx of water, fire breaking out, obviously all the problems with electrical equipment, the playing of musical instruments, any kind of cutting or tearing of fabric. They can also be frightening of animals, an imitation of sounds, which is where you sometimes get people thinking that they're hearing their name being called, but there's actually nobody there, the arrangement of objects into actual patterns, and also bites on individuals and things like that. So that is, of course, quite a wide range of phenomena. Now, while the entry that I wrote actually notes that the range of names makes spotting accounts difficult, so does the range of phenomena itself, because different phenomena lead to different classifications, and that in and of itself makes it difficult to spot poltergeist activity. So to give an example of this in practice, in earlier centuries, some of that phenomena that is now ascribed to poltergeists, such as spontaneous fire, would have been considered something like a religious portent, not the work of a poltergeist. So as a result, records of poltergeists may seem more incomplete than they may actually be, and it's only if somebody's reading between the lines or looking at an account for something else that they might then go, oh, hang on, that actually sounds like poltergeist activity, not whatever's been assigned to it in an earlier period. The fact that the term poltergeist first emerged during the 16th century is also somewhat unsurprising, because after all, this is the era of the Reformation, which was itself marked by a fascination with the supernatural. Now, while the 1540 dictionary marks its apparent debut, it is likely that the term was in use before that, because obviously when people are making a dictionary, they are collecting the terms that people are actually using. They're not just pulling them out of thin air. So people had obviously been using a word like that for at least a little while beforehand, if not longer, but it's difficult to know because that's the first time it's kind of captured in print. Because even Martin Luther talks about poltergeists, although he attributes their activity to the work of the devil instead. So at first, the term encapsulates the idea of a noisy haunting and a rapping or knocking spirit, and that shows how fundamental sound was to the original definition of a poltergeist. And I would argue it's also a degree of communication, because what is a knock or a rap but a means of getting attention? This, of course, does then take us into really interesting territory if we look at something like the Cock Lane ghost, and how knocking and rapping were the only ways to communicate with this supposed ghost. And I'm saying that in massive air quotes, and I do have a bonus episode on that if you want to know more about the Cock Lane ghost. But in 1666, Johannes Pretorius expanded the definition by adding a folk belief that poltergeists were small in size, and he also added that people thought that they were the souls of those murdered in their homes. And this seems to be the first time that anyone conflated the idea of poltergeists as noisy spirits with the spirits of the dead, which previously had been seen as two separate things. And this is obviously certainly the idea that Poltergeist, the film, ran with, although I should point out, even in Poltergeist, the film, not all of the spirit activity is even malevolent at first. And I will happily do an entire episode on Poltergeist, the film, if people are interested, because I did do it in my PhD, but now's not the time. But the thing is, though, that's not the only type of spirit that Poltergeist got mixed up with, because there is also the household spirit. If you've heard the episode that I did on the brownie, you'll no doubt have spotted the household being left in disarray by an invisible entity and try to spot the difference between that and the poltergeist. I've even known of people who have seen poltergeist going, oh, all of those things, that could just be fairies. And I think this is where we start to get some of the slippage, and it shows how actually unhelpful some of these classifications actually are. Because this particular attempt at doing so actually traces back to the original attempt to define the poltergeist. Because the Rumpelgeist, which is a far better word in my opinion, but there we go, from the 16th century, came from the word rumpeln, which was a word meaning both to make noise and to throw. And then you also had the word Gespenst, which was a word used to denote ghosts specifically, and that then went on to become spectre, spelt with an R-E in French, and then spectre spelled E-R in English. But then there was also another term, and this is the important one for our purposes, and that was the kobold. Now, obviously, I'm not talking about the class of beings in D&D. That's a completely different thing. The kobold was a household spirit, often considered to be mischievous, but also one that retreated to a specific room in the house. Now, that might be a corner of the attic or the so-called junk room, and the junk room might become the Polterkammer, which was the apparent source of poltergeist disturbances. And even as late as 1909, a dictionary defined a poltergeist as being a kobold and a household spirit. Now, personally, I don't think that we can or should conflate the poltergeist with household spirits, because the intention behind their actions becomes the clue as to why we shouldn't do this. Household spirits might leave your house in disarray, but it's often because you left it tidy. Whereas if you leave it in a mess, they'll tidy it for you. That is kind of the thing that identifies them as a very specific class of spirits. And we see that right throughout a lot of the folklore, particularly in Britain, where you have the likes of the Coal-Ladder Hilton, or indeed Silky, both of which are obviously northern spirits, I am aware of that, but both of those would tidy a house that was messy and mess up a house that was tidy. That was their thing, and that was how those household spirits behaved. You might also find that household spirits would throw things around because you hadn't paid them, which is a fair point. If you have expected labour from these household spirits and then you haven't paid for it, you can only expect them to get annoyed. That's the intention though, because poltergeists create disturbances out of sheer malice. So household spirits might be mischievous, but they're rarely outright malevolent. And they're also something that can be befriended or honoured, something that you can't do with a poltergeist. So why does the poltergeist even matter, you might be wondering? Well, the poltergeist becomes an important milestone in the development of supernatural thought, because on one hand, it's important for its contribution to the attempt to define and classify spirits, beings, entities, and hauntings. But on the other hand, that same attempt demonstrates that the natural slippage between the activities of such spirits makes classifications difficult. And in some cases, classifications are not just pointless, they're also unhelpful. And I'm sure they're helpful if you have activity and you don't know if it's going to be dangerous or not, but they're really unhelpful if you're just trying to collect or study accounts. And I think that these classifications also speak to a need to rationalise and categorise accounts, but that overlooks the naturally blurred boundaries between types of supernatural phenomena. So I do feel that the poltergeist is really important because of this attempt to try and define what phenomena is associated with the poltergeist. Then there's the attempt of, well, what is the poltergeist? Is it demonic? Is it a household spirit? Is it something else? Is it a spirit of the dead? And obviously, more recently, we've then had this idea of it almost being actually telekinesis on the part of somebody living within the home, which is not something that necessarily appears in some of the earlier accounts about poltergeist activity and so on. Indeed, the one from 858 doesn't mention children in the home at all, other than the fact that they have to move out with their father, because their father is the subject of the activity. But I do think that this is important to bear all of this in mind, because of the fact that where we try and define things, and I know poltergeists now, thanks to ghost hunting programs and an attempt to engage with these things, now have this sliding scale of, oh, now we're up to 0.3 on the poltergeist activity and it's going to ramp up. but that's based on the way that it's been classified since then. And I do sometimes wonder, how can you necessarily be sure that what you're dealing with is actually a poltergeist, or is it something else that's just doing poltergeist behaviour, if that makes sense. But what I did want to do though next week is actually explore some accounts of pre-20th century poltergeists, because obviously we have already covered one before, and that was the Tedworth drummer, discussed by Joseph Glanville in the 1660s. But I am wondering what we might find if we have a look at these accounts before the mass media got its claws into it, because I do often wonder how much our conception of ghosts and paranormal activity now actually comes from films rather than actual activity. That is something that I am curious about, because particularly if we look at something like the paranormal activity films, a lot of what we see could be considered poltergeist activity, because you've got spontaneous fires, you've got electrical things misbehaving, you've got objects moving, you've got people being dragged around, but it's not actually a ghost or anything. It is a demon that has been summoned to do a job. So I think this demonstrates the problems with looking to films for our classifications, but also the problem of trying to use classifications in the first place, particularly when we're looking at folklore, which is going to depend on a slightly different set of terms. So I did think it would be quite interesting, as I say, to have a look at some pre-20th century accounts next week to see how poltergeists actually appear in folklore by comparison with obviously what goes on in the mass media. So I hope you enjoyed that section of Ghostlore. Obviously the rest of the book has 49 other ghosts from around the world. We've got all sorts in there. There are some benevolent ghosts like the one in the Paris catacombs and La Planchada in Mexico. There are some just downright nasty ones. There are some famous ones, like you'll have heard of the Onryo from Japan. We've got the Drauga from Scandinavia. So there's quite a good mix in there. But then what's also cool is, and I'm saying that I'm massively biased, but a look at where certain types of story came from. So if we look at Fisher's Ghost in Australia, it actually hooks into a type of storytelling about ghosts where they're seeking justice for what's happened to them. So if you're interested in how ghost stories have changed and how they work, Ghostlore is for you. If you're just interested in types of ghosts and also where these legends come from and how they've spread and so on, then again, Ghostlore is for you. So it comes out in the UK on the 7th, and I want to say it's the 19th of August in the US. And hopefully you'll enjoy it. It should be available from all good booksellers and so on. So I think you can pre-order it at the moment, and then obviously you'll get a copy when it comes out. So I hope that you enjoy that. I'm very proud of it. Obviously ghosts were my first love before folklore, so obviously doing this kind of thing is always really interesting. But then where I get to see that crossover between ghost legends and folklore is really interesting, because it does really demonstrate that you can't actually separate them. They are kind of just two halves of the same whole, really. So I hope that you enjoy Ghostlore if you do order a copy. I hope that you enjoyed this snippet of it. And I also hope that you come back next week when we have a look at the way poltergeists appear sort of in folklore, because I thought that would be quite an interesting way of looking at things. We may end up having a look at how it also appears in newspapers and things, because there are some accounts that end up in the newspapers, particularly in the 19th century. So we may end up having a look at that as well. I'll see how the research portion of things goes. But there will be an engagement with how these things appear in relation to the stories people tell each other as well. So I hope you look forward to all of that. I look forward to seeing you next week when we can chat a bit more about poltergeists. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.